this has always been fundamental to Xi Jinping's global politics, trying to separate Europe from America. This predates this trade war. It's always been foremost in CCP policy is to try and extract Europe away from its alliance with the United States, and they will see this as an opportunity to do this. The rhetoric about unity in the face of the sledgehammer coming out of Washington. I'm skeptical that it will work. We are seeing more China positive noises coming from the likes of Spain, for instance, but I think the EU has quite fundamental issues with China at the moment.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Ian Williams, who is a long-time foreign correspondent who has reported from Russia, China and Ukraine, and is author of the book Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian, thank you for joining us today.
A pleasure as always.
So the trade war continues. Just this morning we've seen tariffs from China on US goods go up to 125%. How damaging is this going to get?
Well, it's pretty dizzying, isn't it? I mean, there's a certain entertainment value in seeing the way analysts are describing this to prize fighters in the ring, to racing cars powering down towards each other in a game of chicken. Accompanying the hike out of China this morning was a statement saying we won't put it up any higher because American imports to China are already commercially unviable. So there's no point in it going any higher, even if America reciprocates. What will Trump do? Who can say? We're already reaching the sort of levels where trade is becoming almost unviable on both fronts because of the sheer cost implications. So that leaves the question, where do you go next? And you're looking at devices, tools, strategies that go beyond tariffs, which is where in some respects it could get even uglier.
And you mentioned those other tools available. We saw this morning China is putting more limits on US films that can be released. What other tactics could China now use if they are moving away from tariffs, or just think that's as far as they can go?
Well, they've got a whole toolbox. I think it's in some respects it's rather amusing to see Xi Jinping presenting himself as this big defender of world trade, as a bastion of globalization, calling for unity among nations against the Trump madness. Whereas in fact, China's rise has seen it game the system every which way it can in terms of rule breaking and in terms of coercion. There's an entire toolbox that China has developed over the years to coerce companies, to coerce countries, whether it's in handing over technology, whether it's in parroting China's policy lines on various things. So it has got a lot of tools at its disposal. One is to target individual companies or sectors. We're seeing this with Hollywood, with now restricting the number of US films. Well, films were already tightly controlled into the Chinese market, and in fact we've seen this rather ugly performance by Hollywood of kowtowing to Chinese censors by eliminating any criticism of China in their movie scripts. Perhaps that will now change and we'll see a few more Communist Party villains in Hollywood scripts. I don't know, but certainly that sector, the money's not huge, but it's high profile, it sends a message. We may see boycotts organised against specific sectors. We've seen this, for instance, in clothing companies that have had the audacity in the eyes of the CCP to criticise forced labour, say, in Xinjiang, and to distance themselves from that. And those companies have been targeted. There have been huge campaigns online against them, consumer boycotts organised, presented as spontaneous patriots, but of course egged on by the CCP. We may see more of that. We may see a devaluation of the renminbi, the Chinese currency, to make its exports cheaper, to offset some of the impact of tariffs. We may see China looking to shift its exports, to develop its relationships with other neighbouring countries in Southeast Asia. It's already putting feelers out to the EU. It's saying, look, let's unify against this madman in Washington. So there are a whole range of different techniques that China can use, and that's before you even get to the treasury bonds, US debt, of which China is a huge owner, and the potentially destabilizing impact of China unloading those onto the world markets. And although the destabilization that may create would be damaging equally for China.
And you mentioned the bond markets there. Do you think the Trump administration are aware of that and other Chinese tactics, or do they think this is just going to be a trade war back and forth on tariffs? And what sort of damage could that do if they did unload those bonds?
It would destabilize the world market, because it would have a big impact on the dollar, for instance. It would also have a broader impact on bond markets, but driving down bond prices. The issue that China has with that is this could be equally as damaging to the Chinese economy. So it's almost like mutually assured destruction. So we know China's been offloading treasury bonds over recent years at a steady pace, but to suddenly do it all at once could be extremely damaging. But I think that what China's strategy is, my take on a lot of this is that the Chinese economy is in a fragile way at the moment. There's an unsustainable economic model. They're trying to shift to more consumer-driven, more innovation-driven economy, away from sort of the property, the huge infrastructure, the cheap exports, although that remains a hugely important sector, trying to export its way out of trouble. So I think that the Chinese economy is vulnerable, and in this prize fight, you might say it's more vulnerable than the US economy. But Xi Jinping will be calculating that the threshold for pain is far lower in the US than it is in China. And there are several reasons for that. One is because the US is a more open economy, so it is more susceptible for movements in bond prices, which may have been behind the US pulling back on tariffs to the rest of the world. So they're just taking on China rather than everybody. And also the US is a democracy, so the pain of higher prices, the pain of seeing your pension funds reduced, results in a political backlash, a popular backlash, a political backlash. So what it means is that China's calculating that the US may blink first because it may not be able to stand the economic pain, where of course China's a dictatorship. Yeah. Yes, Xi relies on what's called performance legitimacy in the absence of elections. His pitch is, look, we've given you economic growth and stability. And so he's not immune to that. But nevertheless, China's a dictatorship. It could impose more pain on its people than perhaps Trump can in the United States. So all these calculations will be going through the minds of Chinese leaders in Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound there, as they look at how to retaliate next, where to target next. I mean, one nightmare scenario, which I've seen raised in some business circles, is China's made quite a lot of use of hostage diplomacy. This is where business people are prevented from leaving China, exit bans, and they've become more and more frequent under Xi, and usually it's the result of there's a business dispute going on, real or imagined, and people are prevented from leaving the country. And there's a real worry in business circles that you could see more of that as well, targeting high-profile business people with spurious investigations. So the coercive toolkit that China has is far more extensive than that available to Trump.
And, we talk a lot about how China can go on the offensive against this, but you said there, obviously, China's got a quite fragile situation with its economy. Obviously, economic trouble for China looks a lot different than it does in Europe or America, where it would mean recession, whereas China maintains such a high level of growth even when they are going through hard times. But, is this kind of a quite unfortunate time for China to face a trade war?
It is. I mean, I think they've been preparing for one. I think for some time Xi has been trying to make since he came to power, we talk about decoupling, but that was really invented in Beijing 10 years ago. It's been at the root of Xi's policy to make the Chinese economy more resilient, more separate, especially in technology, from the US. So this is something that he's been concentrating on for some time. But I don't think that he anticipated, or the Chinese leadership anticipated, tariffs perhaps of this level. I mean, one of the tactics, the strategies they've used has been to try and shift direct exports away from the States. So it was something like 20% going to the US. Now it's maybe 15 of total Chinese exports. But a lot of that is smoke and mirrors, because it's rerouting exports through third countries. There's been huge Chinese investment in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Thailand, causing some unease in those countries, because a lot of these factories are screwdriver plants putting together Chinese components. Some of them, it's just a matter of relabeling them as made in Thailand or made in Vietnam. And I think that the initial Trump tariffs looked like they were wise to that. But this is one of the techniques that China has. Also, there's an incredible logistics industry out there, which is very adept at ducking and diving and weaving around taxes and tariffs. And don't underestimate the ability of this system to try and find a way through even what appears to be very, very high barriers.
And you said there, of course, that Trump's original set of tariffs did seem to be aware of that. They were particularly harsh on Southeast Asia originally. That's now obviously all dropped back down to 10%. But even still, Asian markets are down, despite that rally we saw yesterday globally after most of the tariffs came back down. How damaging is this for Asia more widely if China gets into this trade war with the US?
I think it's damaging in several ways. One is that they all get caught up in the crossfire, China trying to reroute exports through third countries. There's also a big concern that if the US market, which is the biggest consumer market on the planet, becomes inaccessible to Chinese companies, then there's a lot of exports to go somewhere. And Xi Jinping, in the absence of meaningful reform of the economy, he's still basically a statist, although he's turned around and is making more pleasant noises towards foreign companies and private Chinese companies, tech companies. That doesn't really wash, because he spent most of his 10 years alienating them, driving them out, disappearing of entrepreneurs, business people, curtailing the activities of technology companies. So it's a bit of a hard sell. His main instrument of economic change has been to turbocharge cheap exports. Yes, these have taken a slightly different form. We see a greater emphasis on renewable technology, for instance. But there's huge overcapacity in China as a result of this, mainly because of the state throwing enormous sums of money at building and expanding factories as a way of exporting their way out of difficulty. A lot of this stuff was already reaching world markets at below cost, attracting a record number of dumping investigations at the World Trade Organization. And I think there's real fear within Asia that they could be on the receiving end of a lot of these, in fact, indeed so could the EU and Britain, but in Asia there's a lot of concern about being on the receiving end of this wave of cheap Chinese exports. And perhaps they're more vulnerable because a lot of those exports that may end up in Britain, for instance, we don't have an industry that competes with them anyway. But in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, there are industries there which compete with a lot of those Chinese goods, but may not be able to if the markets are flooded and the prices are low enough. So I think on multiple levels there's a concern in Asia, and that's before you get to the politics with both sides trying to court them. Xi's made it clear, he's off to Hanoi on Monday, that he wants unity in the face of this madness from Washington, and that's the message he's sent to Brussels. It's the message he's sending to Southeast Asia. America, Washington, is making it clear that there will be repercussions if countries are overtly throwing in their lot with Beijing. So for all these reasons, I think there's a lot of concern in political and economic circles in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular.
And we spoke there before about how, there's a big difference in who gets hurt by tariffs in America versus China. The US being a democracy naturally has more of a problem if people start to complain because the prices go up. But China has had troubles recently. I'm thinking about the end of the COVID restrictions in China. That was largely because of a popular uprising. I mean, is there going to be at least some thought in Xi's mind of actually, if we do put these tariffs up, if prices do start to go up, among Chinese people, that there could be some sort of popular reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is certainly on his mind. You mentioned the protests at the end of the zero COVID period, the white paper protests, people holding up A4 sheets of paper, nothing on them because it was a protest against the lack of freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. But those protests encompass the middle class, students, working people. That's what spooked the Communist Party. And at the back of its mind is this concern, because there is this unofficial compact we hear about a lot that the party has with the people, that you steer clear of politics and grasp the abundant economic opportunities we give to you. So keep quiet, shut up on the political front, and we will make your lives better. When and if that starts to break down, then there is a danger that you see protests, that you see unease, and he will be aware of that. And I think one of the ways they're countering that, Chinese social media is just packed at the moment with jingoism, with very racist cartoons about fat obese Americans sitting on production lines, which used to be in China. It's pretty awful stuff actually that's out there. It's very jingoistic, it's very chauvinistic, and it's one of the CCP's techniques is patriotic hackers or patriotic netizens, call them what you will, have always been allowed much more space on Chinese social media than, of course, critics of the regime, who are quickly stamped out. And what you're seeing now is a real surge in this sort of jingoism, chauvinism, patriotism, call it what you will, at the Americans' expense. And you're also seeing, interestingly, we saw this in the first round of tariffs back in 2019, Trump won. You're seeing a lot of old movies reappearing from the Mao era, of the Korean War era, with America as the real villain and Chinese military heroism standing up to the American bully. So I think you're seeing two things here, that yes, Xi is aware that there is a danger of a backlash, it's a dictatorship, but he still has to be sensitive to public opinion to some extent. Xi is not totally impervious to public opinion. We saw those protests at the end of the zero COVID era, when people took to the streets with white pieces of paper, A4, protesting the lack of freedom of expression. And Xi backed down. Soon after that, they abandoned this crazy zero COVID campaign that they had. And I think in the same way, yes, he'll be aware that perhaps there's a greater tolerance of pain in China because there are less outlets to express discontent, but that discontent can still come out in different ways. Now, what we're seeing on Chinese social media, which is fascinating, that we often see this at times of tension or when the party is in a bit of a corner, is this huge outpouring of chauvinism, patriotism, nationalism, call it what you will. We're, some of it openly racist in the way they're attacking the United States, obese Americans sitting on production lines which have been supposedly transferred back from China to the USA, and this attempt to sort of whip up nationalism and jingoism and get behind the party, get behind its trade war with the United States is also part of that whole policy.
And Trump says that China wants a deal, despite all of this bad blood that he's generated. But can he get that deal? And more importantly, even if China says they want a deal, can Trump trust it? I mean, I'm thinking, of the 2017 deal they supposedly struck, which pretty quickly collapsed.
Yeah, I suppose part of the reason for that collapse is we did get into the whole COVID era as well before it really came through. I mean, both sides behind the rhetoric is, we're ready to talk, we're ready for a deal, but it's hard to see where that deal is and how that deal can be struck. And also, there's so many contradictory things that come out, particularly from Team Trump. For instance, when the tariffs were eased on other countries, and it's become Trump versus China versus rather than against the world, it was presented initially by a lot of those around him as a part of an incredibly intelligent plan they had, and all part, very well, method behind the madness thought through. But of course, Trump himself soon said, well, it was the bond markets. They were going crazy, they were unnerved. So there was a real systemic threat to the economic system. So it's hard to see at the moment where that negotiation takes place. Some people have talked about grand bargains with China, but it's hard to see what that bargain could be and where it might be struck. So I'm certainly in the short term, I'm not optimistic that this is going to lead to meaningful talks.
And Xi Jinping himself certainly seems more interested in dealing with Europe at the moment. I mean, I believe he's been in Spain this morning saying that he's called on the EU to jointly oppose US tariffs. Could Beijing use this trade war and those 10% tariffs that are still on the European Union and the UK to pull Europe onto its side?
This has always been fundamental to Xi Jinping's global politics, trying to separate Europe from America. This predates this trade war. It's always been foremost in CCP policy is to try and extract Europe away from its alliance with the United States. And they will see this as an opportunity to do this. The rhetoric about unity in the face of the sledgehammer coming out of Washington. I'm skeptical that it will work. We are seeing more China positive noises coming from the likes of Spain, for instance. But I think the EU has quite fundamental issues with China at the moment, which go much deeper, and their priority is to come to an accommodation with Trump and to do so from a position of strength, to come to a mutually beneficial trade agreement, not to be seen to kowtowing to Trump, but to come to something which benefits both sides. And I think that'll be the EU's priority. And I think they will be very wise to China's strategy of trying to sort of pull them away from the US. And for similar reasons, I think Southeast Asia and Asia are and will remain quite wary of Chinese overtures for multiple economic and political reasons.
And one of those reasons for Europe, undoubtedly, is going to be China's ongoing, not open, support for a war on the continent in Ukraine. Just earlier this week, Zelensky has come out at a quite convenient time and said that there are Chinese soldiers fighting in Ukraine, that they've captured two of them, that there could be as many as 155 Chinese nationals fighting in the Russian military. What sort of impact is that going to have, and might it bring Trump a bit more on side with Ukraine or a bit more on side with Europe?
I think if we weren't in the middle of this trade war, this stepped up trade war, I think this would be a huge story. I mean, Chinese soldiers, they appear to be mercenaries. If they had any official sanction, that would be very, very serious. But nevertheless, the fact that you do have Chinese soldiers fighting with the Russians in Ukraine, I think that will be particularly significant for Europe, because of course the Ukraine war is something which is much more immediate and serious than it is for the Trump administration at the moment. But still, Zelensky is a smart character, and he sees this as an opportunity to remind the Americans of what they're dealing with in Ukraine and the geopolitics, the political stakes that are at play. I think there's a lot more that needs to come out. There's clearly some embarrassment in Beijing as to try and explain how these soldiers, we know that China has supported Russia in multiple ways, economic in terms of underwriting the aggression in Ukraine in terms of technology, dual use. But if Chinese soldiers appearing on the battlefield takes this to a whole new level, even if we put a more charitable spin on it and say that these are soldiers of fortune, these are mercenaries which have popped up on both sides, it's still a significant step forward. And the mercenary argument, well, yes, but China keeps far tighter control over its society than we see in the West. And it's, I think we're going to see more of this. And I think that it's interesting to me that we haven't seen anything overt coming out of Washington yet to follow through on this story.
Well, I was going to come on to that because, Trump has said he will look into it. But it's surprising, isn't it, that the US haven't acted more so far on China and Russia's cooperation in this conflict, isn't it?
It is, and this has been a big issue for Europe, particular, and it's the first thing that Europe raises in conversations with Beijing, is its support, overt and covert, for Ukraine. I think there are those in the Trump administration who are quite hostile towards Zelensky and towards Ukraine. I think there are others who will want to use this as a way of reminding Trump of what the stakes are in Ukraine. And, there are bigger geopolitical issues at play other than just Russia against Ukraine. And I think this will be a useful tool for those who are close to him, Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, people who have a record of being strong supporters of Ukraine and very critical of China. So I see this emerging over the coming days, especially as now we may have reached peak tariffs and you're seeing both sides look for other ways of pressuring their rival.
Well, just to finish, Ian, we're only a few months into the Trump administration. Do you think China is ready and resilient enough for 4 more years of this?
I think this will have come as a shock to Beijing, the sheer size and intensity of the initial blast from Washington. I think that the next 2 or 3 weeks are going to tell us whether there is room for negotiation, whether there is some strategy, some method behind the madness coming out of Washington, or whether this does effectively mean a hard decoupling of the two economies. But I think there will also be those around Trump that will be reminding him that, look, if your end game in this is technological superiority over China, then you might inadvertently, sometimes innovation is best achieved in adversity, and you may actually be galvanizing the Chinese economy in a way that runs counter to your original aims of coming out on top as a technological power. So I think the next 2 or 3 weeks are going to be intriguing to see where this begins to lead and what other weapons and tools both sides have in their armory.
Well, Ian Williams, it's been fascinating chatting with you about this today. And of course, if our audience want to learn more about China's position and its economy, there is your book as well, Vampire State. Where can people find that? Online, through my website, most good bookshops. It's very timely. Yes, indeed. Well, Ian, thank you very much for joining us today on The Trump Report. A pleasure.